That's right, Mason. We're going to start off with our favorite overrated, underrated. And believe it or not, ladies and gentlemen, instead of Notre Dame this week, it is Alabama. That is unexpected. Alabama did lose to number 11 Texas. First home loss, and I think since 2019. I mean, pretty good bit of time. Questions for me is the quarterback position, which we brought up in the last episode. Is Milroe like the guy to go to? And to be honest, it's really questionable right now. In that game against Texas, he did not show out how you expected an Alabama quarterback to show up. But I think that Nick Saban is a smart guy. He's got the brains for it. He chose this guy for a reason. He does have the legs for it. I definitely am going to say, though, that Alabama is overrated. But I'm very intrigued to see if that quarterback position, improves. Because I definitely think that Alabama could be a top-tier team once they get the offense put together. Isaac, what do you think?
Well, Joey, that's a great observation. And honestly, I've got to say that I'm personally just shocked at the fact that Alabama has had 2 seasons now where they've kind of started off kind of slow. And this year, obviously, is due, by and large, to the quarterback position. 2019 was a great year, by the way. The last year they lost at home. But I digress. The quarterback position for me is the biggest question mark for Alabama. I'm going to say that right now, given how they played on Saturday, they are overrated. They fell to 10th, which is very low for Bama, and I'm very intrigued to see how they turn it around. They looked rough. I mean, they lost by double digits at home. The first time that Saban's lost by double digits at home since, I think it was 2002, 2003. It was when he was at LSU. I know that. And so that's a long time for Saban. So 20 years of not losing a game by double digits at home was impressive. So they're overrated, but Nick Saban's a smart guy, and I think they'll figure it out. But the question is how and with who?
This is Alabama's first loss at home since to LSU and Joe Burrow in 2019. I think our questions about Jalen Milroe and the Alabama secondary were answered, and that's where I wanted to bring up. I don't think that the quarterback position is the only questionable position right now. I think that O-line and that secondary is still pretty questionable. I made a call last week that I said Alabama secondary better watch out because these Texas receivers are fast. Jatavion Sanders, Adonai Mitchell, and yes, Xavier Worthy was all over them all night. So fast, outrunning their corners and their safeties all night. So it's pretty obvious to me that they are still not fixed at that position. And something else, too, that a lot of people were hyping up their O-line. But Milroe got sacked like 2 or 3 times. I think Texas's defensive line was pretty underrated this week. But for me, I have Alabama as underrated still. It's a top 11 matchup. Yes, it was at home, but yes, they're still struggling. Saban said that he didn't want to depend on the quarterback as much. And to me, they didn't have to do that. Jalen did obviously make mistakes, but there was other positions that took over and, really tried their best. Jermaine Burton, although he got a couple touchdowns taken away from him because of, other penalties on the offense, he did make some good plays. The running backs, McClellan, he made some big plays. He got the offense downfield. Yes, if they don't make some of those mistakes, Alabama makes it much closer and may even win this game, which is why I still have them underrated, which will pretty much move us into the next team we're going to talk about in Texas. Texas got the dub against a top 5 team on the road. It's their first win against Bama since 1982, and it's their first time in the AP top 10 since 2010. And to me, guys, I think this settled the debate. If Quinn Ewers doesn't get hurt last year, they win that game in Austin. Quinn Ewers showed up. He showed out. Yes, they had a little bit of stall, going for fourths and, shorts early in the game, but they went into the half 13-6, and they ended up winning this thing by 10. Obviously, I have Texas right now as underrated. And if we had any more space in the poll, I probably would have them within the top 3.
Yeah, Texas definitely is a solid team. I don't know about having them in the top 3 quite yet. There's still some questions to be had there. As you said, one of the big concerns about Alabama is that offensive line. Like, they're already not a great offensive line, but within that game, was it Texas's defensive line or Alabama's lack of offensive line, and so on? For me, at least as of right now in the AP rankings right now, I think Texas is right where they should be. Their offense is very stellar. There's still a little bit of some things they need to fix up, but I think that they're right where they need to be.
So those are great points, and I do want to talk about, just real quick before I get into it, I would agree with Mason, and we all said this last week. The question became, if Quinn Ewers didn't get hurt in Austin last year, what happened? And I would agree with that question was answered this past week. However, I'll also say that Texas went in, obviously they went in Tuscaloosa. It's not easy to win. Bryant-Denny, a top stadium in the SEC, top stadium in the country. And they beat what I consider to be a kind of middle-of-the-road Alabama team so far. I mean, Jalen Milroe, Alabama secondary, again, did not look great. Quinn Ewers looked really good. I've got to say, as far as overrated, underrated, I personally, I would say they're just a bit, and this is simply because of the question marks with Alabama. I give them a little bit of an overrated, just because they're going from 11 to 4. And for me, number one, that's a big jump. And number two, I understand who they beat, but it's also one of those things of, hey, Alabama doesn't quite have it figured out yet. So I would say that Texas, they look good, but they're a little bit overrated for me still. And it doesn't help the fact that they don't play another ranked team until the 1st of October, assuming Oklahoma stays in the polls. So we'll see.
And kind of before we move on to the next team, another thing, a little bit of Clemson in me. People saying, is the Dabo dynasty over? Well, after this kind of loss, guys, is the Nick Saban dynasty over? No, I'm just kidding. I'm kidding.
That will be TBD.
Well, yeah, there you go. But the Washington State Cougars beating Wisconsin again, defense winning the game. Wisconsin coming back a little bit in that second half, but State holding in, sticking strong. They were undefeated in this home and home, which is, kind of amazing. They had Gardner Minshew as the last big name that everybody remembers, and that's pretty much it, at least that I can think of. But for overrated, underrated, I don't know. I guess you would have to say they're. No, I can't do it. I still got to say they're overrated, y'all. I mean, you got to put them up against some of these other top 25 teams, other than Wisconsin, who has a record of just the past few years just not playing very well. They haven't been playing good football. Yes, they put out some great offensive linemen into the NFL. They put some great running backs into the NFL, but they're not great in college football. So even though they had a great win, I got them overrated. Mason?
So my 2 points about this team last week was, the first one was, yes, defenses win championships. I'm a defensive guy. That's why I picked Washington State, and I was right. It was close, but Washington State pulled out the dub because their defense was able to hold on. Number 2, we asked a question, and this was a point. Would the AP drop Wisconsin out? They were number 19. Would they drop Wisconsin out if Washington State won this game? And we said probably, because the AP is not messing around. Were we right? Absolutely we were right. AP is not messing around. Both teams that lost within 20 to 25 were out. Actually, 3 teams, 19 to 25. Wisconsin losing to Washington State, Texas A&M, which we're going to talk about in a second, losing to Miami, and Tulane losing to Ole Miss, which they kept it close against Ole Miss, and Ole Miss scored in garbage time, so I'm really actually surprised that they got pushed out, but it was to make room for the other teams that haven't had a loss yet. So, yes, we were absolutely correct about that. As far as whether or not Washington State is overrated or underrated, I can't make a decision on that. I say they're right where they need to be. I think Washington State, played well on both sides of the ball. They threw well, they ran well, they played defense really well. So I got them as right where they need to be. Like a lot of these teams, it's super early season. I'm waiting to see what they're going to do here in the future, in the next couple weeks even. But right now, I got them right where they're supposed to be.
So you mentioned, I want to piggyback on this just real quick from what Mason said. He mentioned that defense wins championships. And a point that I just want to make about this game is that Washington State gave up more yards than they had themselves. 368 versus 332. Not a huge discrepancy there, but it does lend itself to think, okay, there were some question marks there. And on top of that, you have to think about the fact that it's interesting they gave it less than 400 yards, which seems to be a rarity today. As far as overrated, underrated, first of all, Washington State looked pretty good, but I'm going to also agree with Mason. They're right where they should be. It's early season. They're not they are a Power 5 school, but they're not a top-tier program, so to say. And so I'll say they're right where they should be, and congratulations on going undefeated in the home and home.
So from that, we're going to move on to Wisconsin, who, is the loser of this game between the two, and, the winless team of the home and home. So, like we said, they dropped out of the AP poll. Is that too much? We, like Mason said, we saw a few teams drop out of the top 25. Some who ended up winning, Clemson. But Wisconsin, is out. They were within the top 20. Now they're out. Are they overrated? Are they underrated? Isaac, why don't you take this one?
So this is a tough one because it's not like they were ranked in the top 12, right? Now, we can say, well, they only give up 332 yards, which, by the way, is impressive in today's college football world, especially with a school like Washington State who tends to have an air raid offense. You look back at Mike Leach there several years ago. All in all, they did lose to an unranked team, but even though it was a two-score game, it was still relatively close. Washington State's defense is what clinched it for them. I would have to say, given they lost to an unranked team, they were just inside the top 25, probably a little bit overrated. Wisconsin, they are a what's the word I'm looking for? A renowned program. Everyone knows Wisconsin. You think about guys like Jonathan Taylor. So a couple of big names in the NFL now came from Wisconsin. So traditionally, past few years, they've kind of pushed out some good names. However, they haven't been a great program. I'm going to say they're just a bit overrated. They're out of the top 25, and we'll see if they can recover once they get back to Madison.
Let me tell you something. Just really to obviously talk about Wisconsin losing and dropping out of the top 25 and kind of answering your question, Joey, is that too much? Here's something that's happening in college football that is different from every other college football before this year, in the past probably 10 years. The SEC as a whole is not the best conference in college football this year. The other conferences are actually stepping it up. Right now, it looks like the ACC and the Pac-12 are two of the best conferences in college football. I mean, they're showing up and they're showing out. So what we're seeing is because there's so many more conferences now, even the Big 12, that looks so good, the AP has no choice but not to mess around. If you take a loss, you're out because there's so many other good teams in these great conferences now that haven't lost a game. They may have played a better team. I remember you asked me a question in the chat, right? Clemson won the game against Charleston Southern, but they sputtered early and went into the half 24-17 against, a horrible opponent.
By the same reasons they lost to Duke, yeah. 2 turnovers leading to scores, yeah.
Exactly, which turns into them dropping out. And you say, well, how does UCLA deserve to be over them? Well, they beat Coastal by a good margin, and they beat San Diego State by a pretty good margin. Two of the biggest teams in the Sun Belt and the Mountain West. So with that, it's like they are not going to play around. You have to win your games this year because every other conference is good. It's not just the SEC and then a drop-off and then the Big Ten and then another drop-off and then the Big 12, Pac-12, and ACC. It's really anybody's championship this year. Any conference's championship this year. So, I mean, that's why. Yes, it seems so that wow, you can't believe 19, they lost, such a close game to an unranked team on the road. They only lost by 9 points. It doesn't matter. They took a loss, and that's all it takes now, especially if you're that close to the bottom. Clemson won. They had a loss. They won, and they still got dropped, right? So, yes, this year is a winner, you're out kind of year for the AP because so many of the conferences are actually good and playing great football now. As far as Wisconsin, no, I would say that Wisconsin is not overrated. I say that they're still underrated, and here's why: they kept it close against that Washington State team. Washington State, it's not a easy place to play. The fans still show up. It's not the hardest, stadium to play in. It's not the, even in the top 10, but it's still a hard place to play. And those students show up, and they did, and they made it hard for Wisconsin, and Wisconsin wasn't able to withstand. But Washington State, I want to see where they go. I want to see what they do in the next couple of weeks. Did they, make a run for the Big Ten still? I want to see what happens. So right now, I still got Wisconsin underrated.
All right, moving on to kind of like what Mason brought up, the SEC not being better than the ACC. Miami takes down Texas A&M. So we're going to start off with Miami, guys. Last week I was saying, the biggest thing about Miami is we saw improvement from them last year to this year in their first game. And, you know, that improvement showed even more against Texas A&M, or was it a digression from Texas A&M? For me, I think Miami was definitely underrated. As you know, if you've been on our YouTube page, we have a YouTube short where I talked about the dark horse of the ACC, in which I chose Miami. So far, they're doing good, man. They're doing real good. But yeah, I think Miami is definitely underrated. And I'm going to go ahead and put my pick for Texas A&M. I think they're overrated. I think they're overrated for the fact that it's Jimbo Fisher. I think that Jimbo Fisher, his last good year really was at Florida State. You know, yeah, he had some good wins at Texas A&M, but his last good solid year was Florida State. And, you know, the only reason they've been ranked so high in these past few years is because his name and, you know, yeah, they have a good recruitment class, but they don't play well.
I would actually have to disagree with that. I would say that his last good year was 2020. And if you want to say, well, that doesn't count because it's an asterisk, that's fine. But I would say personally that I think Jimbo's last good year was in 2020. I mean, they made a run for the playoffs. They only had 3 losses, and some people were arguing that they should have been in over Notre Dame and Ohio State. And I know you say only 3 losses, but don't forget that was the year that the SEC had to play every single team in the SEC, which was not good for a lot of people. I'm with you though, Joey. I have Miami as underrated. I think that they looked really, really good. Obviously, look with all these teams, I want to see how they do down the road. But I do also have Texas A&M overrated. They're making the conference look horrible. Like, why? Come on. I mean, you call yourself the Deep South because you're Texas and you belong here, you know. But like, show up, please, or you know, fire Jimbo. You know, either one. But please stop making the conference so horrible.
Yes, here's the thing. Miami, I mean, they lost to Middle Tennessee State last year, but that was last year. So with that said, Miami, they did get the dub against A&M. Not a great A&M team, but I would have to agree that they are still a tad bit underrated. I'm still on the dark horse trend with Joey. Now, A&M, I'm going to hammer them because they're an SEC school. They're overrated. Jimbo is, and I'll tell you this, Jimbo is fighting for a job. That's what I think. Now, A&M's boosters, and they're like, oh, this is the guy, but he's had a couple of really good recruiting classes, namely the past 2 years, and they still went out there and, let's just be honest, they didn't play that well. A couple of, they kind of fell apart late, and A&M's overrated. They're making the conference look bad, and although they may make LSU look good this year, I don't know, we'll see. But A&M's overrated, and yeah, that's what I got.